Well, I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. Patrick Henry. The most sweetest of words, liberty, to be free, to be unconfined, to do as you please. Today's the 2nd of July, and I'm coming to you like a hillbilly, a hill rod, to talk some American history. And the reason I put my sleeveless Neo-Mag shirt on, custom made by me, for me, is because this is how I grew up, man. This is me, no pretension. And what I was thinking about as I was doing some chores today was some unlikely heroes of our revolution. You know, it's been said many times, he with the most ink writes history. And there are people that I think should be remembered, and historians do remember them, but often they are not talked about in the broader context of our revolution. So I'd like to share a couple of those men with you and challenge you to dig deeper. I'm not a historian, I'm just a guy that likes to read, and as I travel, I go and see these places and spaces. Henry Knox, let's start with Mr. Henry Knox. Not a hillbilly, he was a bookkeeper. He sold books. He had a bookstore in Boston. And old Mr. Henry Knox taught himself through books the art of the artillery. And as the war spun up, he ended up getting involved. He was put into the Continental Army. And as the Battle of Boston was underway, the siege of Boston rather, he concocted a plan and he said to General Washington, let me take some men and just go on a little walk up to Fort Ticonderoga. I just Googled, did a little map search. Today, to go from Boston to Fort Ticonderoga is about 200 miles with highways. At that time, this was frontier. This was wild, uncharted, uncivilized land. This was no roads. Through much of this, clearly no bridges and things of that nature. This was wilderness, raw, rugged wilderness. At that time, it was more of a 300-mile journey one way. So, Knox set off with a group of men to go to the fort. When they got there, they had to take the fort because it was in British control. So it wasn't that they were just going to go collect some cannons. And when they got there, they had a pretty easy time of taking the fort over. Then they had to take 62 tons of cannons. 62 tons of cannons. Not 3 or 4 cannons, 62 tons of cannons. In the wintertime, 300 miles back to Boston. They did it in under 60 days. That's incredible. And when they got there, Mr. Knox didn't take a nap. Mr. Knox didn't go on vacation after this arduous trip through the wilderness. Mr. Knox began to design and build a place to set these cannons up on the heights around Boston, and then proceeded to use these cannons to drive the British out of the Boston harbor, changing the tide of the war. Mr. Knox comes back in many stories and tales, but we'll bring up another gentleman, Mr. John Glover. John was a fisherman. Just a lowly fisherman. And without John Glover, his name should be praised every time you hear it cross your ears or lips. Without him, General Washington would have never had that famous Delaware crossing. You see, it's easy for a general to say, get my men across the river. And we, in this modern time, we think of crossing a river, yeah, big deal. Drive across, get some boats, go across. They had to first go procure the boats, which at that time meant that they went to a man that was in the business of ferrying goods, and they basically stole his boats for the greater cause. See, there's always tales that are not told. We see the glory and the beauty of a revolution, but we forget sometimes that there's some hardship. They went and took this man's boats, and these boats were really just these big flat wood boats that were meant for carrying ore, grains, things of that nature. Now this river, getting to be wintertime, is full of huge chunks of ice. The night that they crossed the river, Christmas night, 1776, The reason that they needed to get across was they needed to make an attack. They needed to do something. The general's army, the Continental Army, was being run all over New England, all over the countryside. They were screwed. They really had no significant wins. Mr. Glover not only gets these men across, but he does it 2 times in one night. They cross. They march to Trenton. These guys are exhausted too, by the way. They've been out in the cold. Their muskets soaked, powders soaked. They're exhausted. Some of them are marching barefoot. They're marching without food, without fuel for the body, 10 miles after they cross this river. This is not just like some little cross a little creek and you win the day. Getting across took hours. All the while, these men are out in the open. Then they get a 10-mile walk into Trenton. They need to go quick because as the sun's coming up, the Hessians, Germans, the most trained fighting force on the planet, if you didn't know this, the British and much of the world hired mercenaries. Still happens to this day, and the Hessians were some of the most vicious, ruthless fighting men on the planet. They had been partying on Christmas, and that's what Washington was betting on. They caught these men in their beds, and they took them, captured that group, killed the colonel that was there, and had a significant win. Did they rest? Nope. General Washington told John Glover, now get my men back across the river. And he knew they needed to get back across the river because the British Army was nearby. And if they had that river at their back, they would have been decimated. He said, nobody's resting, nobody's eating, nobody's sleeping, nobody's celebrating until we get our boys back across the river. And that's what they did. That was just one of the times that John and his men, fishermen, did heroic acts that without those acts, we would not have won the revolution. You and I wouldn't be talking as we are now. Previously, the Battle of New York, if not for John Glover and his Marbleheaders, as they were called, Washington's army would have again been wiped out. During a retreat, which unfortunately the general's army was getting very good at, retreating, if not for John and his Marbleheaders, Howe would have rushed in and just wiped out the Continental Army. At 5-to-1 odds, 5 British or Hessian troops for every 1 Marbleheader, he kept them at bay for hours. His men, this is where the American guerrilla warfare really started, were running and hiding behind stone walls, sending volley after volley of musket balls, musket shot at the British, suppressing them, keeping them down so that they could not advance. They thought there was, in some writings, they thought there was a much larger force. These guys were tenacious. In fact, they were so well regulated, side note, Second Amendment, well regulated means trained. It means spun up. It means ready to go in the vernacular of the time, something that's worth noting. That it was said that they may have been the most trained and organized unit in the Continental Army. Really, John Glover applied what was required to be successful at sea as a fisherman. He applied it to battle. These men followed him. They listened. They were organized. They were detailed. They were long working, I guess is the word I'm looking for. They didn't quit. They got the frickin' job done. Why talk about these guys? Why talk about Knox? Why talk about John Glover? I talk about them because oftentimes we look at like the big picture. We look at this celebration of our nation's birth coming up. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Well, if we believe that, do you believe that you personally have the same gifts, the same talents, the same abilities in you as Glover and Knox to sway the course of a nation, that ultimately sways and swayed the course of mankind? And we're on this ball of dirt and water, spinning through space at 1,000,000 miles an hour. We're just little specks of dust in this great universe. But the things that we do while we are alive matter. The liberty the liberty that these men fought for matters. It might not matter at some other place far off in the cosmos, but it matters here. It matters here. And what you do while you are alive truly indeed does matter. These men believed in this greater cause of liberty to the point that they gave their lives for it. Mr. Glover's wife lay dying. He came home to be with her. She passed. He went back to war. He told the general at one point, Washington, he said, I need to be home with my family. My business is failing. My wife has died. I need some time away. And General Washington said to him, I'm paraphrasing, something pretty much to the effect of, I understand, sir, but the British don't, and we need you. And so he came back. These men gave everything, not so that in the present they could have money or fame, but so that now we in this present could do as we see fit. We see too much of what we don't like and we fixate on it. So my challenge to you, study these men, the women that were there at that time as well. Study the things that they did, both good and bad, in the context of their time and ours. By I mean the context of their time is we cannot judge, and I say this often, the mistakes of history through the optics of what we know today. Before the Wright brothers perfected flight, people thought that they were lunatics, right? Now we all know that man can fly by harnessing the power of lift and thrust. It's a fact. We can't look back and point fingers and say that they did this or that wrong. We weren't there. We didn't live the life that those people lived, nor did we see the world through the optics that they did. Who will look back at us, at you more specifically, at the things that you do in this life and judge you? Knowing that, will it change the way that you approach life? We live but once. We live but once. As another founder said, I have but one life to give. How will you spend it? Cherish the liberty that you have. Even if you feel that it is somehow stripped from you, study this history. Look at it, because it will help you see more clearly. It will help bring gratitude to your heart. It should. So on this upcoming Independence Day, go read about these people. Whisper their names as the fireworks blow and tell them thank you. Liberty, how sweet it is.